Tormented Souls is one of my games of the year. It's not a perfect game, it has more than a few significant problems, and it's for sure not going to be for everyone. But having said all of that, I can categorically say that it's one of the best survival horror experiences I've played in the last decade. So let me explain why. Survival horror is a genre that's seen many changes, peaks and troughs in the last 30 years or so. While it seemed for a while like it was vanishing into obscurity at the start of the 7th console generation, it would see something of a resurgence as we moved towards its end, and such proceedings have continued through the 8th console generation and now onto the newer wave of consoles. Capcom have seen great success with both new entries and remakes of their Resident Evil series. I'm still hoping for an Evil Within 3, and new studios have sprung up that are seemingly completely focused on only horror games. Most recently, we saw the release of Bloober. Most recently, we saw the release of Bloober Team's previous Xbox and PC exclusive, The Medium, on PS5. Heralded as a return to survival horror's golden era, namely that of the late 90s through to the early 2000s, The Medium would receive a mixed reception, with some praising its apparent old-school sensibilities, an interesting use of dual realities, and others slamming its basic puzzle design and tone-deaf approach to many of its themes. Since its initial launch, it's also been reported that Bloober Team have been hired to make a Silent Hill game, presumably due to how they channeled some of that franchise's inspirations in The Medium. Well, having played both The Medium and Tormented Souls, I'm here to tell you that Konami have perhaps unsurprisingly made yet another fatal error, because while The Medium, much like Bloober's other games, had some interesting ideas, watered down into a largely forgettable, tonally inconsistent, ill-executed experience that swung between enjoyable and frustratingly badly handled, Tormented Souls is the game it wanted to be, or perhaps the game it thinks it is. While it's clear Tormented Souls had a smaller budget, less resources, and a smaller team behind it, its passion and commitment to its inspirations are absolute and unquestionable. In short, while I'm a huge fan of the original 4 Silent Hill games, I'm skeptical of anyone tackling the franchise, aside from Team Silent or maybe Kojima and Del Toro. But the developers behind Tormented Souls, Dual Effect and Abstract Digital, might be our best shot at getting some of that magic back. Whether you enjoy Tormented Souls or not may be somewhat predictable by how you react to the very first screen you are greeted with after the developer and publisher information. The minute many see this screen, they will instantly understand what kind of experience they're in for. For the uninitiated, this type of screen and phrasing would be the first thing many gamers saw in the late 90s when they loaded up their first Resident Evil game on their PlayStation 1, or Dino Crisis, or Silent Hill. And it's the perfect trigger to make any who frequented the survival horror genre back then instantly reminisce about how things used to be. While it might not seem like much, this opening screen is in fact a thesis statement for the entire game, and it's one that is stuck to with a level of passion and adherence that I have seen in few projects in the last decade. Standing as one of the weaker elements, the story here is monumentally inspired by the genre's past to a point that often borders on straight-up derivative. Players take control of Caroline Walker, a young woman who receives a letter from the hilariously named and supposedly derelict Wild Burger Hospital, which is situated in a small lakeside town named Winter Lake. The letter, reportedly from 2 young children, seems to indicate that they're trapped there, or perhaps even being held there against their will. Unable to shake the feeling that she's connected to them somehow, Caroline goes to investigate, and shortly after arriving is knocked out by an unseen assailant and placed naked in a bath with a respirator shoved down her throat. Upon waking up, she also realizes that one of her eyes has been surgically removed, for reasons yet unknown. Trapped and confused in sinister and unfamiliar surroundings, Caroline must now uncover the mysteries of Wild Burger Hospital, and maybe even the town of Winter Lake. So for any longer-term fan of survival horror, or maybe just those who have played the classics in the genre, much of this will sound very familiar already. It's a small lakeside town, just like Silent Hill. The letter from the unknown or impossible sender, just like Silent Hill 2. The lone female protagonist uncovering the mysteries of a large labyrinthine structure, just like several of the Resident Evil games, and many other examples of the genre. The list goes on and on. Speaking of the large structure in which our protagonist finds herself, few elements of Tormented Souls work as an analogue for the game's inspirations more than Wild Burger Hospital. You see, Wild Burger is a stately mansion converted into a derelict hospital, allowing it to act as an amalgamation of both Resident Evil and Silent Hill's most famous locations, the Raccoon City Mansion and the hospital. The plot itself is a little more in the Resident Evil mold, with a lot of ridiculousness, melodrama, and convoluted plot points that occasionally contain some interesting ideas and concepts. Unfortunately, as with many of its elements, Tormented Souls' narrative suffers from somewhat of a kitchen sink approach, trying to cram in as many ideas inspired by staples of the genre that it can think of. All of this comes together to form an inconsistent and disjointed tale, which lacks cohesion or a sense of true identity. It also keeps many of its themes as surface level as possible, leading to a story that can feel a little lacking in depth. Taking yet another page out of the classic survival horror playbook, a fair amount of the deeper lore here is contained within optional readable diaries and notes scattered throughout the mansion, hospital, whatever spooky place. This does allow for some depth to be added and some much needed extra exposition that really only serves to improve things. All in all though, story and narrative are not Tormented Souls' strongest points, and they're only hindered further by one or two other problems that we'll get to in other sections of this video. What all of this ends up meaning is that the story is a serviceable way to deliver the game's stronger elements, but also a bit of a waste of what could have been a much better executed and well-written tale. Much like the rest of the game, it's once again clear where inspiration lies for many of the elements seen within Tormented Souls' design and gameplay. Essentially, there are two main activities the player will be engaging in throughout the game's 6 to 10 hour runtime, and these are solving puzzles and combat. Let's start with the weaker of the two, combat. As you explore the huge labyrinthine structure, it's not long before you come across several various enemies who seek to hinder your progress. While there's not a ton of different types, and many of the game's more interesting foes are seen towards the game's final third, there are at least a few variations to keep you on your toes. From grotesque experiments to creatures who were once patients that still have their drips attached, most either shift towards you at various speeds for a melee strike, spit a difficult to see acidic blood-like substance at you from afar, or do a combination of both of these things. In order to best these foes, Caroline has a few options. Run and try and avoid, which I personally only found led to more frustration, or fight back, with an initially small but eventually reasonably sized arsenal of weapons. While for the first half or so of the game, the only offensive weapons available to our heroine are a relatively weak nail gun and an even weaker crowbar, the addition of a shotgun and a few other toys later on does allow for a nice feeling of slow power progression without ever reaching anywhere near OP territory. The reasons for this balance are varied. First of all, enemies hit hard and take a fair amount of punishment. Second, ammo is very scarce, meaning you'll have to pick your battles wisely. And third is how the combat dovetails into one of the game's other mechanics, Caroline's relationship to light and dark. Basically, for reasons that are still relatively ambiguous even by the game's conclusion, Caroline is unable to stay for any length of time in darkened areas without taking damage. This means whenever walking around the often dark hallways of the abandoned structure, she must carry a handy lighter found early on in the game. However, if Caroline is holding a lighter, she cannot hold a weapon. All of this means that stumbling into a new area, room or corridor, where enemies can be heard roaming around somewhere in the dark, quickly becomes a mad dash to either find a candle to light so you can switch to a weapon and make your stand, or an unlocked door that you hope will lead you to an area free of foes and filled with a brief respite. All of these elements are extremely well balanced, and the escalation in enemy difficulty is matched perfectly to the discovery of new weapons and minimal resources, creating a situation where every encounter needs to be carefully weighed up. The problem is that actually executing some of the actions you decide to take or not take can often be very janky. Weapons most of the time don't feel satisfying to fire, feeling impactless and weak. Enemy animations are jagged and awkward, foes can be easily exploited or will get caught on geometry, and a general lack of responsiveness can rear its head at the worst possible times. All of this means that what you're left with is serviceable combat that can frustrate and falls short of greatness in significant ways, but despite such harsh criticisms, still comes nowhere near ruining the game. In fact, it sounds weird to say, but I actually feel like some of this at least may have been the intention. It's awkward in that very specific way that was rife in the PS1 and PS2 era of survival horror, and much like the rest of Tormented Souls, its referencing of such an era is one I struggle to stay angry at, warts and all. The second main activity players will undertake in Tormented Souls is puzzle solving, and it's here where the game really excels in my opinion. I don't mean to keep bringing it up, but one big criticism of the aforementioned The Medium was its puzzle design, or more specifically, that aspect of the game's lack of challenge. During its marketing, it was touted as a return to a different time in survival horror, where action took a backseat to atmosphere and puzzle solving. Stressing the game's lack of combat only served to reinforce this notion, and many were expecting Resi PS1 trilogy levels of long-winded, multi-stage puzzle design. However, upon release, the game would fall short of this concept, providing only the simplest of puzzles and feeling in many ways more like a linear, tailored experience. Tormented Souls, on the other hand, makes good on this concept, providing a gameplay experience that is equatable to any PS1 or PS2 survival horror classic you can think of. Not since the glory days of the genre have I enjoyed such intricate, convoluted puzzle design, and it's fucking glorious. As you explore the halls, rooms, and open spaces of Wildberger Hospital, you'll find yourself checking every corner, searching intently for either much-needed supplies, like health or ammo, or another item to be used in some bizarre, extravagant puzzle. And these puzzles are not fucking around either. There are items that I found at the very start of the game that I didn't use until literally the final areas. I've seen some reviewers say that the puzzles in Tormented Souls are trying too hard to replicate their inspirations, leading to them being too convoluted, illogical, or obscure for the player to understand without looking at a walkthrough. Now, while there is some credence to this point, I think it stops short of completely valid. You see, I do think in many ways Tormented Souls does undermine its own sense of identity by trying a little too hard to imitate what came before. However, I think to level such a criticism at its puzzles is not really viable, and this is mainly due to the fact that the puzzles in those older games were just as bad, if not worse. Basically, the puzzles in these games were always batshit crazy. Like, think about how convoluted it was to get anywhere in Resident Evil 2's police station on PS1, and then tell me that that place operated at maximum efficiency. In reality, it would take like 6 months to train a new recruit how to get into half of the rooms. My point is that this type of moon logic, despite that term's normal appropriation with adventure games, is part of the experience. Yes, there were times in Tormented Souls when I was stuck. Yes, there were times when I had no idea where to go. Yes, there were times when I had to backtrack to almost every area of the hospital to figure out what I'd missed. And despite occasional moments of frustration, I basically loved every second of it. And speaking of frustration, you should know going in that Tormented Souls can be a punishing experience. Enemies hit hard, take a lot of punishment, and you go down quickly. Also, there's no checkpoints or difficulty settings. On top of this, much like the ink ribbons for those familiar with the PS1 Resident Evil games, Caroline must find tape reels in order to be able to save, and their general scarcity means that there will be long periods of gameplay where if you die, you lose a fair chunk of progress. But much like the games that inspired it, such events in Tormented Souls actually often serve to enhance the experience. While in the moment things can be frustrating, you will often find that you will repeat a section you have been made to redo with much greater efficiency, and in the end become a better player for it. While this isn't always the case, such design felt again like a return to a bygone era, where map markers, linear experiences, and generous checkpoints were nowhere to be seen. And while there is definitely a place for all of those things, they were not what I grew up on. This is your granddaddy's survival horror, so you better get used to it. Bitch. When it comes to presentation, Tormented Souls is a bit of a mixed bag. Let's start with the good stuff first, namely its environments. So, much like the older Resident Evil games, Tormented Souls employs fixed camera angles. However, unlike Resi, these scenes are not 3D character models on 2D backgrounds, but are instead completely three-dimensional, allowing for the camera to move around areas when the developer wants it to. Once again drawing comparisons, this technique was also used in the medium, and it seems to seek to amalgamate the older aesthetics of the genre with newer console technologies. For the most part, this was a great choice, and serves to create great atmosphere and tension, as you'll often be unable to see the threats that may lay ahead or behind. Moreover, it's also allowed the environment team to really take their time over framing each shot of the experience, allowing for some fantastic lighting, VFX and texture work. In short, the environments look incredible. While such a camera system does sometimes lead to angle shifts that can send your character the wrong way or leave you disorientated, this is unfortunately almost always an issue in any fixed camera experience. And the developers having included both tank and non-tank controls when using either the left analog stick or the D-pad, respectively, is a nice touch that helps mediate this a little. Speaking of disorientating, the maps that can be found in each area can be difficult to navigate, as you're not shown your position or orientation on them. While it appears that this was once again by design, it should also be noted that this has been mediated by the game's most recent patch, which has added both a glowing UI indicator designed to show players which section of the map they are currently in, and a one-button system, which means players can pull up the map by pressing the R3 button, instead of having to go through their inventory to look at it. So now we come to the not-so-great elements of the presentation, namely the characters, animations, and voice acting. While in certain lights the characters and monsters can look decent, often they unfortunately cannot live up to the high standards of the environments, making them often stick out as a little lifeless and antiquated. This is unfortunately also true of many of the game's animations, with cutscenes and combat being two areas where things look notably worse. However, all of these elements pale in comparison to the voice acting, which might be the worst I've heard since the original Resident Evil. In fact, it's so bad and invites that comparison so much that I wonder whether or not this too was intentional. I mean, listen to this.
These girls are the same twins as those in the photo. The ones that will awaken the devil are ready for their operation. It seems like the girls are being prepared for some kind of surgical procedure. If I don't find them soon, something terrible might happen. Where can I find Dr. Williams' office?
You can find Dr. Williams' office on the second floor of the West Wing.
Thank you, Father. Stay safe. A letter for me? I never receive letters. An old magnetophone. Why are all the lights off? I don't like this.
I feel the same.
Recording my progress might be useful if anything happens to me. I never receive letters. And my eye had been removed. Why? Why would someone do such a thing? What? I'm sorry. I don't remember you. Something terrible might happen.
You can find Dr. Williams' office on the second floor of the West Wing.
Recording my progress might be useful if anything happens to me. I never receive letters. What?
I don't know. Either way, for me at least, it only served to detract from the experience and make me feel way less invested in the characters and their story. So, as you may have gathered from both the footage and some of the observations that have already been made, Tormented Souls is a little janky.
West Wing.
Now personally, this serves mostly to endear me to the game. It obviously didn't have the budget or team size seen by the likes of Resident Evil Village, and yet for my money, the developers still produced an experience closer to what I would consider true survival horror, regardless of this. However, this is not to say that all is well in this department. On several occasions, Tormented Souls either crashed out or hard-locked completely for me, forcing a full restart. Now, I played on PC, so I'm not sure what stability is like on consoles, but in a game with no checkpoints, minimal saving, tough enemies, limited resources, and long sessions before any progress can be logged, this was a problem. Now, to be fair, in the entire time I played Tormented Souls, I think I had maybe 4 or 5 instances of this occurring. But while that doesn't sound like a lot, I lost at least an hour of progress on around 4 of these occasions. And when the game is around 8 to 10 hours long, you soon see how this could frustrate. In the devs' defense though, they're only a small team and have already been consistently producing patches that have served to improve the game's stability exponentially. I'm sure they'll get to a place where the game is completely stable soon, and as I said earlier, it's not enough to ruin the experience at all, but just know going in that the jank can occasionally be the biggest threat to your progress. In terms of replay value, there are multiple endings available here, although unfortunately they're all triggered based on decisions you make right at the end of the game. Such design means a carefully placed save will allow all outcomes to be experienced with relative ease and de-incentivizes multiple playthroughs. However, having said this, there are still some interesting trophies and achievements to try and attain, akin to modern Resident Evil games, such as beat the game without saving or beating the game without using a health item, etc. But if you're not about them trophies or them achievements, then these will probably matter little to you. Other than this, there are collectibles to find that will help further flesh out the story, but that's about it. Which is a shame, as unlimited ammo or new outfits, or even a new playable character, would have been great additions that served to make me jump right back in after seeing the credits roll. There has been some indication that some of these features might get added as free updates in the future, so hopefully if that does happen, we won't have to wait too long. While in many ways Tormented Souls can get in its own way, occasionally undermining its own potential by lifting too many ideas from its inspirations, it nonetheless succeeds where it counts. It's an 8 to 10 hour, pure, unadulterated survival horror experience, with great puzzling, tangible atmosphere, and decidedly old school design philosophies and levels of difficulty. Moreover, it only costs $20 US. Given all the previous elements and observations, my established love and history with the survival horror genre, and the current contemporary price point for modern new releases, I don't think there's been a game released this year that's better value for money. While its voice acting is atrocious,
What?
its animation and characters antiquated, and its combat and story only serviceable, much of this feels connected to its intentions, which were, clearly, to make a PS1 survival horror game on modern hardware. And such an intention is one that has been realised to the fullest. And while this might not be the case for everyone watching, all I can tell you is that I personally got more of what I've been looking for from this genre than properties like Resident Evil have offered me in the last 20 years. Don't get me wrong, I love Resident Evil, even the contemporary entries. But for me, the remake of the original, which originally released back on the GameCube in 2002, was not only the purest distillation of the franchise, it was the pinnacle of the survival horror genre. And while in many ways an imitation, Tormented Souls captures at least enough of that magic to not only make it a solid recommendation, but to also place it firmly as a personal Game of the Year contender. If you've been missing old school survival horror, I recommend checking out Tormented Souls.
I never receive letters.